All right, so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to do just a brief review of international advertising. Then we're going to talk about, in more detail, about personal selling and expatriates. Remember last time we talked about expatriates? And then we're going to talk about pricing and the significance of pricing in international marketing. So who could tell us, who could give us some of the key takeaways as it relates to international advertising? What do we say were some of the key factors in advertising on a global basis? Yeah, Dennis?
The coding and the decoding is very important. That you kind of have to tailor the way that each message is received and translated specifically for each different market.
Absolutely. So that's our responsibility, to make sure that the message is properly coded and also decoded. And you say, what do you mean decoded? That's our responsibility as well? Yes, as marketers, we have to make sure that the message is properly processed. And if it's not properly processed or interpreted by the target audience, then we have to take accountability for that. And we're investing a significant amount of money in advertising. We want to make sure that the message is received and it's properly decoded. What would be some examples of where there's been issues in advertising? What would be an example of where there's problems? Think of an example. Go ahead.
So for the Chevy Nova, I think it was, or Nova, it means no-go in Spanish, and they just didn't figure that out when they went to Latin America. Absolutely.
So when we advertise, our primary objective is to build brand awareness. And so in every ad, we're going to include the logo and also the symbol, if the company has a symbol, and the tagline for the organization. Who could tell us what's the difference between the logo and the symbol? Because sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, but they're really not the same. What did we say is the definition? Good.
I think we said a logo usually has words in it, but a symbol doesn't necessarily have to have words in it. So
both are a graphic representation of the brand. Both are a graphic representation of the brand, but the logo is going to include the brand name. So it's a graphic representation of the brand name. Whereas the symbol, as Ezra is saying, doesn't include words.
Doesn't necessarily.
So, by definition though, we refer to a logo as a word mark because it includes words. And what words does it include? The name of the brand. It's going to include the brand name. That's the function of the logo, is to take the brand name and to communicate it in a graphic way that's memorable to the target audience. And also, ideally, protectable, adaptable, and also transferable. So the logo, when we talk about transferable, we want to make sure that the logo can be used in other markets. And then we're not going to have the problem like Rotem is saying that if we have a brand name that we want to use in other markets, that it's going to be transferable. It's not going to be inappropriate or inconsistent with the product or service that we provide. It's not going to be something that's offensive. So Rotem reminded us that when Chevy introduced the Nova into Mexico, that there was a disconnect between the brand name and the functionality of their product, which is a car is supposed to provide transportation, but the name, in this case the sub-brand Nova in Spanish means no-go. And stuff like this you can't make up. This is not an exaggerated example. This is real. Big companies make big mistakes. So we shouldn't think that just because a company has deployed a certain strategy or marketing tactic that it's smart. It could be something that's a big mistake. So what else do we need to keep in mind when we're advertising on a global basis? What are some of the challenges?
Sometimes, our own knowledge isn't enough, and we have to, either get locals from there or send someone there to learn the culture, the norms, the markets, in order to, be able to market toward them.
Absolutely. So we got to customize the messaging. Very often, the messaging has got to be customized so that it's relevant to the local market. Not all markets for our product or service are going to have the same requirements. The USP, the unique selling proposition, can vary for our product from market to market. The needs and wants of the target market can vary. So our marketing communications also has got to vary. So ideally, we would have one commercial that we could use everywhere in the world. Of course, that would be the most efficient. But one size does not fit all. So we have to customize the messaging, and not only the messaging, but very often we have to use different talent. And it becomes very expensive because we have the cost of production, the cost to produce the commercial, the cost to produce the print ad, for example, and then the cost of placement. And we said, importantly, the media types varies by market, and so does the cost. So in different countries, we're going to have different access to different media types, and we should expect that the cost per thousand, in advertising we always talk about CPM, which is cost per thousand. And you say, well, wait a minute, shouldn't it be CPT? Smith, right? Cost per thousand. Oh, coach made a mistake. Watch this guy. M is what? In Roman numerals, we know that M is thousand. So in advertising, we talk about cost per thousand because what we're trying to do is compare different media buys. So, for example, how do we know, is it enough to know just the price of placing a particular ad? Or do we need to know something else? So if I tell you, for example, that in Better Homes and Gardens, the price of a full-page color ad that's going to run one time is $800,000. Actually, it's more like $400,000. $400,000 to run an ad one time in Better Homes and Gardens. And another publication is going to charge us $200,000. So right away you say, well, I was born at night, but not last night, coach, right? This is a no-brainer. $200,000, come on. That's got to be the better deal. But do we have enough information in that scenario to make the decision? One ad is $200,000 and another ad is about $400,000.
Well, they could be totally different types of publications. So Better Homes and Gardens is being read by a certain market, while this could be, a totally different market reading, Sports Illustrated, for example. So they're reading Sports Illustrated, you're going to get a totally different clientele. If you're trying to advertise, kitchenware, you might want to do that in Better Homes and Gardens, and you wouldn't Sports Illustrated.
So the target audience, the demographics of the target audience may not be a good match with that particular publication. So we may not have the best coverage. There may be a lot of waste. That's what Ezra's saying, is that, well, the people that we want to sell to, our target market, don't read that particular magazine. That's true, absolutely. We're going to look at that to see what is the level of waste. What's the coverage? Is the readership 40% of the people that we're trying to reach? So in other words, is 40% of the people that read that magazine, are they our target audience? Or is it 50%, 60%, 80%? And it's very challenging. It's rare that you're going to find a publication where there's a perfect match. That's why it's very common when we advertise in magazines that we advertise in 10 to 12 magazines. Because one magazine is not going to be enough to reach our target audience, to reach everyone in our target audience. But what else do we need to know? So Ezra raised a really good point. What else? What do you think? Are we ready to decide? I'm telling you, one ad is $200,000. The other one ad is going to cost us $400,000. Why can't you guys decide? What you seem? Are we? Are we paralyzed? Are we at a point of indecision? One ad is twice as much. One ad is going to cost us twice as much. So we should choose the less expensive ad, no?
There's also coverage in general as opposed to just specific coverage. You could say that, you know, this or a certain publication only gets 100,000 subscribers, while the other one gets, you know, 800,000 subscribers. So you'll say we'll get more coverage in general, even, you know, depending on obviously the markets.
Absolutely. So we need to know the level of circulation. What is the readership? How many subscribers do we have? So Better Homes and Gardens, for example, has approximately 8 million readers, right? They have a circulation of about 8 million. And what about if I told you that the other publication only had a readership of 3 million? Now what do you think? Now what do you think is the better deal? So we could buy a full page ad for $200,000 and that publication has a circulation of 3 million. Or we could place an ad in Better Homes and Gardens, a full page color ad for $400,000, which is approximately what it costs to run a full page ad in color in Better Homes and Gardens. And they have a circulation of about 8 million. So which do you think is the better deal now? It's better to advertise, in this case, in Better Homes and Gardens. Even though the ad is going to cost us $400,000 instead of $200,000, but we're reaching more than twice as many people. And so how would we calculate the cost per thousand? How do we calculate it? So we take the, what?
400,000.
The cost of the ad, divided by the circulation, and then multiply by 1,000. So who could crunch the numbers for us with those examples? Who could tell us? Who could help us with this? So we have ad A, ad B. This is 200,000. 400,000. We said the circulation here is 3 million.
Yeah.
Circulation here is 8 million. So now what we want to do is calculate the cost per thousand. So what do we get? 200,000 divided by 3 million is what? tell us?
I'm sorry, 0.06667.
Which one?
200,000 divided by 3 million.
It's how much?
0.06667. 3 sixes.
Times 1,000. It's how much?
66.67.
And what about here? $50, right? All right, so what does this tell us? So this tells us for this ad, the cost to reach 1,000 people is about $67. The cost to reach 1,000 people here is only $50. So now you see how this changed our decision. Here we were just looking at the cost of the ad. We said, if we just look at that, well, 200,000 is definitely cheaper, much less expensive, much less than 400,000. But when we go through the calculation, cost per thousand, we find out that this is really the better deal. The cost per thousand is much less. Now, sometimes you could sort of eyeball this. What do I mean when I say eyeball it? You could kind of look and say, yeah, this is like the better deal. Just by looking at it. You say, yeah, well, this is like more than twice. How many times?
More than double.
More than double, right? You can say, well, yeah, the ad is going to cost twice as much, but obviously you're going to reach more than twice as many people. But now the challenge is that we're going to have to look at dozens and dozens of populations. Then it becomes really difficult. You need to be able to calculate the cost per thousand. You need to be able to either do that through a software application, a media software application, or at a minimum, you got to put together something in Excel. Because after one or two of these, it gets messy pretty quickly. And you're not going to be able to just kind of like look at it and say, yeah, well, yeah, my gut says that looks like the better deal. Especially when you're doing so many, when you have to look at literally dozens and dozens of different publications. Because we want to look at the cost per thousand. But, Ezra raised a good point, it's not just about cost. Sometimes we might choose this publication, even though the cost per thousand is more, because maybe the readership of the publication is a better match with our target audience. So in other words, more people that read that magazine are people that we want to buy our product or service. Now, to give you some insight, these numbers, $50, $67, $85, in the United States, and less, some it could be like literally like $15, $20, but the range, right? So I want to give you a sense of perspective, you know, from $20 to $100 in print in the United States. That's what you could expect. So let's say on some occasion you crunch the number and you're doing some analysis to buy media in the United States, and you get a number that's like 1,972, then you know something is not right. Like you punched in the wrong number in the calculator. In the United States, in other markets, it's very different. But in the United States, to give you a sense of what to expect, those numbers are realistic. So these are realistic numbers. It's not something that I made up. That's what you could expect. on the exam, for example, you're doing a calculation and you get some number that's like way over 100. There's something that you didn't do right. So keep that in mind. Now, what else? What else about advertising? As we think about advertising outside of the U.S. What about reach versus frequency? We need to make a decision whether or not it's more important to reach a lot of people fewer times, or is it better to reach fewer people more times? The more people that we're going to reach with a given media or a given medium, the more expensive it's going to be. So the more we're going to have to pay. The more times, the greater the frequency, the more expensive, the more that we're going to have to pay. Does that make sense? So a full-page ad like this is realistic. All ads, all full-page color ads in magazines in the United States, outside of the United States, do not charge the same price. They can't charge $400,000 for their ad. Do you see why? They can't charge $400,000 for a full-page ad. They only reach 3 million people. But since they're reaching 8 million people, they could charge more. So reach and frequency in global advertising and advertising in general is important. Frequency is very important because it takes time for the target audience to be able to learn the messaging, to process the messaging. In commercials, for example, typically commercials are 15 seconds. People are not going to remember what the messaging was, or very often what brand is even being advertised, because there's so much clutter. What is that? What do we mean when we're talking about clutter?
You said like background noise, basically like if what's the person doing while they're seeing your advertisement. So if they're watching TV, sometimes they're not necessarily watching your advertisement. They're doing the texting in the middle, or they're attending to their kids' needs. Who knows?
Absolutely. So there's distractions, and also even if they were literally sitting there watching, and when we do copy testing, what we do is we create a video segment and have people watch it. We have programming, and we insert commercials.
They might not remember it.
And still, because of the number of competing commercials, people still have trouble remembering. So when you ask them questions afterwards, you say, well, you just watched this show for half an hour. Can you tell us what the first commercial was that you saw? Because you see one commercial, when it goes to break, you see one commercial, that's 15 seconds. Then you see another commercial, and then another commercial, and then another commercial, another commercial, another commercial, and another commercial. Am I exaggerating? Isn't that the way it is? And then you go back to the program.
A lot of the time it's the same commercial.
Sometimes advertisers realize that could be compelling, is that within that period of time, they repeat the same commercial because it's going to be more effective in getting the target audience to process the messaging. So absolutely, that's definitely a good approach when you think about advertising during certain programming. What's the difference between flighting and pulsing?
Flighting is when you kind of have it planned over a long period of time. Like you're going to do it like for 2 months and you're going to stop and you're going to do it again. Whereas pulsing is more like very brief, lots of it at a time. Like, Christmas is a good example when all of a sudden you start seeing the Hesh chart commercials. That would be an example of pulsing. It's one very specific time, very quickly, and then retract it.
So you're saying that pulsing is their advertising only during certain times of the year. The Hess commercial, is that what you're saying? With Hess?
Well, more like but brief period. Like pulsing is more like the brief period of time, very intense. Whereas like flighting is, they know like every 2 months we'll run an ad in this magazine, or it's more on a schedule.
So,
consistent.
Go ahead.
No, flighting is more of a consistent return,
Yeah.
whereas pulsing is more inconsistent.
Well, so which one of those two are we advertising all the time, but then during some periods we ramp up and spend more money on advertising? And which one is we advertise for 2 months, then we skip 2 months, then we advertise for 2 months, skip 2 months?
That's flighting. The second one is flighting.
So tell us, go ahead now, so tell us. You guys pay attention. Because these are two key media strategies. Once we decide which magazines and which channels and stations and the day parts and so on, then we have to decide, well, are we going to advertise every week? Or are we going to, and then in some weeks, we're going to spend a lot more on advertising. So do we advertise every week, and then for Mother's Day, we advertise a lot more. For Father's Day, we advertise a lot more, and so on. So tell us, which one is which?
So pulsing is when you're advertising and you concentrate it and there's more of an intense, end quote, influx of your ad or whatever you're running, and it's more concentrated and it's out there more. And then fighting is, based on the schedule you want to do. Every 2 months you're on for a certain amount of time, then you take a break, and it's kind of like to clear it away. Then you remind them with the next 2 months, and it's like cyclical.
So what impact is that going to have? What's the difference in the impact? What's the concern that you might have if you're not advertising at some minimum level? Doesn't mean insignificant, but at least at some level all the time, versus advertising for 2 months and then stopping, and then advertising for 2 months and then not advertising for 2 months.
I was going to say, yeah, the pulsing is probably a little bit more efficient, because at a certain point people were seeing a lot of it. So something that you saw a lot of, at a certain time, okay, maybe during that time you'll remember it, but then there's always that, every 2 months you'll be reminded, and that reminder might remind you of when it was very concentrated, when there was a lot of it, as opposed to the every 2 months, which is, okay, it's a reminder here and there, but it's not as strong as the other one.
Good point. Go ahead, Evan.
Balanced competition. Other companies might take the advantage and start advertising all the time. You're only advertising every so often, so then they'll probably take your business.
So we're not going to be top of mind.
Right.
Especially, so one of the things that we need to consider is, what is the amount that competitors are spending on advertising? So Evan makes a good point. Well, if we're advertising every other 2 months, well, what about in the 2 months that we're not advertising? What are our competitors doing? Maybe that's when they're going to saturate the market with radio spots and TV commercials and print ads. So we need to decide what we think is going to be appropriate for our business. Is there a situation, an industry, a business that we might have that would make one of those strategies more appropriate? What do you think? Why might there be, what situation would exist in an industry where you might advertise for 6 months out of the year, and then not advertise for the other 6 months. Go ahead, Evan.
Pharmaceutical company, like they make like 12 cold drugs, during 12 cold season they'll advertise a lot, but when it's not 12 cold season they're not.
Yeah, so there's some seasonality in that business. It doesn't mean that you can't get a cough in the summer, but they know that there's certain peak periods, and that's where they want to really be top of mind. So businesses where there's some seasonality, that's going to influence our media strategy.
Yeah, but also there are a lot of companies who would advertise anyways. Like, let's say like companies that make snowblowers, they're going to advertise anyway. They're going to push you hard to buy them, even though like comes wintertime, it may not be snowing. They want you to buy the business anyway. You can convince them like you should buy for the upcoming season, already starting in like September or October.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. Even if there is some seasonality, it doesn't mean that you just advertise heavy during the season, but you also have to get a jump on the season, is what Josh is saying, is that, well, when do you buy a snowblower? How many people buy it in December, and how many people buy it in August? Because, with advertising, there's what we call a lag effect. It takes a long time. It really takes a long time for people to process an ad. And we want to be top of mind when they're in the market for a snowblower. So we can't just think that, well, it's going to snow tomorrow, so we're going to advertise. We have to be advertising a reasonable amount of time before the expected point of purchase. So it's not crazy. What Josh is saying is not crazy. Of course, they're going to advertise in August for snowblowers. When do you think that they advertise start advertising for swimming pools? Maybe if you're going to have an in-ground swimming pool. Well, if you have any hopes of having an in-ground swimming pool for the summer, you can't hire somebody in July. I mean, you're going to think they got to start. Hopefully you have good weather. They're going to start in February or March at least. Start, doing the digging and constructing the foundation for the pool. Anything else about that? All right, what did we say about expatriates? What's some of the important takeaways when we think about personal selling and how we use expatriates? Because we said manufacturing has its challenges. We have to decide whether or not we're going to make or we're going to buy the product. And if we make it, are we going to make it in the home country or in the host country? So that's a big decision for us. And we said we have to decide what is going to be our mode of entry. Are we going to make in the home country and then export? Are we going to use foreign direct investment as our mode of entry? Or licensing? Or is it going to be a joint venture? But that being said, of course that's important. How are we going to staff the organization? If we're going to operate on a global basis, if we're going to be a multinational corporation, how are we going to staff the sales and marketing organization? That's something that's very important that also needs to be decided.
There's an upside to having expatriates and also an upside to having locals as well, because the expatriates will bring experience from the existing company to wherever you're establishing it now, and the locals will bring market experience, things that they know already about the culture of the market, and then this also relates to, I guess, preparing the expatriate for going into this new market. Maybe getting him acquainted with certain social norms, a language, or how the workplace is conducted.
Absolutely. So we said it's not a no-brainer to just say, oh, okay, we're going to send over some people. And so when we do that, they're referred to as expatriates. but there needs to be a plan in place so that the people that we send are prepared. And we gave a number of examples. We talked about, well, do you speak the local language? That's a challenge. Now, even if you go through 6 months worth of training, you're not going to be fluent, but at least you should know enough of the language that you could engage in conversations with people. So you know conversational French or conversational Spanish or conversational Chinese. Companies make mistakes in that regard. Sometimes they don't put people through the proper training, and they don't have enough support in the host country for the expatriates. Remember, we talked about housing. We said, look at how much trouble we have to try and get an apartment in Manhattan. Could you imagine what happens if you move to China for your company? Who do you call? Who do you talk to? I mean, how do you, right? You just get on a plane with your knapsack and what? I mean, somebody needs to be on the ground that's going to help us, especially because we're not just sending Lautman. We're going to send several people, presumably, maybe several dozen people even.
Well, for Jews, we have Chabad. They're all over the world. They could hook you up.
So that's helpful. But we would like to think that the company would take the initiative in providing that support for us, because it's a big investment. It's not cheap to have expatriates operating throughout the world. That's not when companies do that. Don't think that, oh, that's like, they're going cheap. This is like, it's like a cost-saving measure, that this is, the inexpensive way to staff the organization, because it's definitely not. Nobody will tell you that it's inexpensive to have expatriates operating in a host country. It costs the company a lot of money, and that's why in some cases companies decide not to do that. And we talked about the idea of having virtual expatriates. Well, you know what? We're not going to move you there. You don't need to live there. Maybe we'll send you there once a month. You'll go for 3 days. Or maybe sometimes it will go for a week. Or maybe we'll have video conferencing. We'll have a regular video conference so that the local managers can talk to executives in headquarters to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Or maybe you'll send 2 expatriates instead of 24 expatriates. But for sure, some companies will send people from the home country to the host country to try and maximize the effectiveness of the organization, the profitability of the organization. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Because hope is not a plan. So you need to have a plan. People need to be prepared. And what about if you're moving with your family? What about if you're married, you have 3 children? Schools. Yeah, there's a lot of details that are involved. So all of those things need to be addressed. And then when it doesn't work out, we talked about last time that there's a lot of finger pointing. Well, it was your fault, it was my fault, it's the company's fault. We have to set ourselves up for success. Now, when we think about selling a product or service around the world, we have to decide what is going to be our pricing strategy. So once we've segmented the markets and we've targeted particular markets. Let's say we decided that we're going to sell in China because the level of disposable income is high enough that consumers can afford our product, and China is the most populated country with 1,300,000,000 people, and we don't feel that there's any political risk or limited political risk. We have to decide how much we're going to charge for our product. In order for us to do that, we need to understand our costs. How much does it cost us to make and sell the product? So we have to identify our manufacturing costs and our non-manufacturing costs. We have to identify what we refer to as our cost of goods sold and our selling general and administrative. So our cost of goods sold are our manufacturing costs. The selling general and administrative, SG&A, is our non-manufacturing costs. So we need to understand the cost in order for us to determine the price. Does that make sense? And we're going to talk about demand-oriented pricing approaches, cost-oriented pricing approaches, competition-oriented pricing approaches, and target profit approaches. When we talk about the cost of goods sold, very often we use another term, which is product cost. And there's three classifications. When we talk about product cost, there's three classifications. There's direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. When we say that a cost is direct, whether it's direct materials or direct labor, what it means is that we could easily trace that cost to a particular product. So for example, when we talk about direct labor, that means that for a particular product that we're producing, that we know the laborers, the people that are operating the equipment, we know how many hours they operate the equipment to produce that product. And we know how many hours workers operated equipment to produce another product. We might produce 24 different products. If we could easily trace back the cost to a particular product, then we refer to that as a direct cost. So direct labor, though, doesn't include the cost, let's say, that is incurred from employing a plant manager. Because the plant manager is responsible for managing the entire plant, and we said in this plant we make 24 different products. So the plant manager, that person's salary, we consider to be an indirect cost. Because we can't tie that back to product A, or product B, or product C. So that cost we classify as an indirect cost, which is part of manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead includes indirect labor and indirect materials. So manufacturing overhead would include the cost associated with employing a plant manager. Those three classifications are product costs. Those are manufacturing costs. But the amount of money that we spend on advertising, right? We just had a whole discussion about how much money we're going to have spent on advertising and the level of frequency and the reach and the cost per thousand, and whether or not it's going to be flighting or pulsing. Those costs are non-manufacturing costs. Those are selling, general, and administrative costs. So those are costs that occur after the product is produced. So the money that we pay to the president of the company, to the sales manager, to the sales representatives, those costs, for example, including the electric bill for the headquarters, those are non-manufacturing costs. But keep in mind, the electric bill for the manufacturing facility is a manufacturing cost. So it's not, if somebody said, well, what about electricity? Say, it's a trick question. So they ask you that in an interview, it's a trick question. Why? Because it depends. It depends if it's the electric to operate the manufacturing facility or to operate the corporate headquarters. If it's the electricity that we need to operate the manufacturing facility, then that's a product cost. That's a manufacturing cost. But if it's to operate the headquarters or the sales office, we're going to consider that to be a non-manufacturing cost. So we need to know the difference. Now, once we establish what our costs are, then we're going to determine the price. Now, there's a number of what we call demand-oriented approaches to pricing. Let's talk about penetration pricing, skimming, prestige pricing. Are you familiar with any of those? Who could tell us the difference? What's the difference between skimming as a pricing strategy versus penetration pricing?
I think I'm pretty sure penetration is like when you enter the market, you'll start a little bit lower, and then you'll get a feel of what the people want, and then you'll move around your price, as opposed to skimming, which is, I think, starting higher and then seeing where it goes, and then maybe moving it lower, maybe keeping.
Well, somewhat. Yeah, you're in the right ballpark. Right? We got to clarify a couple of points. Skimming, yes, we start at a high price. We start at a high price, and then in a planned way, we lower the price over time. So the decrease in price is something that's deliberate, something that we've already planned for. That's our pricing strategy. So it's very common in technology segments to use a skimming approach to pricing. So think about the diffusion of innovation model that we talked about. Remember, we talked about the adoption curve model. So how do we accelerate the rate of adoption? How do we move from innovators to early adopters to early majority to late majority? How do we move through those different stages of the diffusion of innovation model? Well, one of the things that we could do is we could lower the price. That's one of those controllable factors. And in an elastic market, or in a market that's somewhat elastic, because not all markets are either perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. What will happen is that when we lower the price, demand will increase. At a lower price, more people will adopt the product. More people will purchase the product. The first VCR that I purchased, do you guys know what VCR is? What is it? VCRs, right? The first VCR that I purchased at Macy's. You guys are familiar with Macy's, right? They're renovating the Herald Square store. They're spending $400 million on the renovation. I bought my first VCR there. It was at least $1,100. At least $1,100. $1,100. We could walk down to Rite Aid and buy one for $39. Is that, how do we explain that? Well, the way to explain that is that in electronics, in technology, it's very common that they would start out at a high price, like even $1,100, and then lower the price over time. Now, retailers and manufacturers, we have to consider their strategies independently. What do I mean by that? So in other words, some retailers are high-low retailers. Like Macy's is a high-low retailer. Some retailers are EDLP, which are everyday low-price retailers, like Walmart, for example. But that's different from the pricing strategy of a manufacturer. So the product was being sold at $1,100, not because Macy's overcharges for their products that they sell, but because companies like Magnavox, Sony, Philips, other electronics companies introduced something that was innovative, and they decided that they're going to introduce the product at a high price and then lower the price over time in a planned way. And from $1,100 to $1,000, $900, $800, $750, $700, etc., continually lowering the price with the expectation that as they lower the price, more people are going to purchase the product. That's a good example of skimming. But, like Ezra was suggesting, that we might take a different approach. What we might decide to do is introduce the product at a low price. Hey, why not? Let's sell them right out of the gate. We're going to start selling VCRs at $39. With the expectation that we're going to sell hundreds of millions of them within a fairly short period of time, versus and move rapidly through the adoption curve model. So we're going to quickly sell to the innovators, early majority, and also the early adopters, early majority, late majority. We have to decide for our product and service what makes sense. Is it skimming? Is it penetration pricing? Now, importantly, with penetration pricing, you start at a low price, and then you could go even lower, but it's usually impossible to raise the price after that. Do you see why? Because if you're selling at a low price, then people are going to be reluctant to accept a price increase. So what happened if I said, okay, we're selling VCRs for $39, and we're on the market for 3 months, and then I said, all right, now we're selling VCRs for $59. Yeah, we've put ourselves in a bit of a predicament. Now, we might say, well, this is the upgraded one. This one has also DVD capability. You might, but we need to think that out beforehand so we don't paint ourselves into a corner, because it's usually difficult to raise the price. Even in markets, for example, that purchase commodities, for example, to make their product, to make a finished good product. It's very difficult and usually impossible for them to pass on the increase that they've experienced because of changes in commodity prices to the customer, to the end user. And retailers also don't want to accept or allow manufacturers to pass along the increase. And even when you sit down and talk with the buyers, and you could sit down and talk to the buyers at Walmart, for example, right, the corporate buyers that buy products for Walmart, and you say, but, you know, the price of oil has gone up very significantly, and that's an important component in our manufacturing process. You know, our costs are, to make the product has gone up 25%. And they say, well, I know, but we can't pass that on to the customer, because they know in a price-sensitive market that if they raise the price, that they're going to sell less units. An important demand-oriented pricing approach is also prestige pricing, which means that the price is set at a certain level because the goal is to establish a level of prestige for the product. And even at a higher price point, the product becomes more desirable because it is at a higher price. So, for example, how many ties do you think that you could sell at $5 for Father's Day versus if you sold the same ties for $50? Do you think you would sell more ties for Father's Day at $50 or at $5? Evan, what do you think? Tell us why.
It's Father's Day. You want to buy something meaningful? You want to spend more money for the person?
Yeah, so in this hypothetical example, at $5, you think, wow, at $5 you probably sell a lot of ties. But for Father's Day, many people would think that, well, a $5 tie is not expensive enough. I want to buy something good. I want to buy something nice for my father. So ironically, at $50, the tie is considered to be more desirable. Like, oh, okay, that's a good gift for Dad. Questions about that? So those are some examples. Yeah, Blanco.
How are you?
Fantastico.
So doesn't it depend on the brand a lot also? Like, meaning like if the brand is like a fancier brand that looks like it's worth $50, and it's like Calvin Klein or something, but it's only $5, then would it be more effective to buy a $5 one of that fancy brand than the $50?
So in terms of the brand, when we talk about creating that element of prestige, the way that that comes to life is the association between that higher price point and the brand name.
So you're saying it'll ruin the brand name if they make it lower?
So if you're selling, like you said, if you're selling Calvin Klein, I wouldn't do that. Not that some luxury brands don't have discounts on their products, but most of them are reluctant to do that because of the change in perception of their brand. So if you want to maintain that perception of prestige, if your pricing strategy is a prestige pricing strategy, then you're going to lose that once you lower the price from $50 to $5. So over time, then people are not going to have the same perception of your brand. That's something that we need to decide from a strategic perspective if we want to do that. But I think that what you're saying is true, though, that the perceived value then is going to be very high because they're still thinking, I'm getting a $50 tie for $5. But after a while, after you buy enough of their ties at $5, well, then you stop thinking of it as a $50 tie now. Now it's a $5 tie. You can't be both. It doesn't mean that you can't have sales and things like that, but we have to think through the implications of our pricing strategy, especially if our desire is to implement a prestige pricing strategy, then lowering the price is something that we need to consider very carefully before we go forward with that. But let's talk about cost now. There's a variety of different cost-oriented pricing approaches. One of them is cost-plus pricing, and another is standard markup. Cost-plus pricing, a good example is in drugstores. Drugstores on prescriptions are known to use cost-plus pricing. So this is something that I know from experience. What the pharmacist does, what the retailer does, is they add a certain fixed amount, usually. It's very common. They add a certain fixed amount to the cost for the prescription. So let's say the cost for, let's say, the allergy medication for a month's supply, they pay $150. Then they add, depending on what the customers will bear, so to speak, they'll add, typically, now this is a real number, very often in a lot of markets, they add $5 to the cost of the prescription. So that's not a made-up number. In a lot of markets, they add $5. Some markets, they try to get 10. Some markets, they add 15. If the neighborhood is more affluent, they might add 20 or 25. But $5 is considered to be the norm in most markets. So you see how that's an example of cost-plus pricing? See how that's different in terms of the thinking? We're not thinking about demand anymore, per se. Of course, there's demand implications, but very different from skimming, penetration pricing. Now we're saying, well, what did it cost us? And based on what it cost us, we're going to decide what we're going to charge. See, we didn't even talk about that when we talked about penetration pricing. I never said to you, well, we're going to sell it at $39. It cost us $20 to make it. I mean, you need to know what it costs to make it. But when we sell it for $1,100, what does that mean? Does it mean that it costs us $1,000 to make it? Maybe we sell it at $1,100, but it might still only cost us $20 to make it. In that case, we're saying, well, that's not relevant. We know how much it costs to make it, but that's not what's driving our pricing decision. It costs us $20 to make it, you don't need to know. We're going to sell it at $1,100 because we know that maybe 3% of the market is going to purchase the product at $1,100. Those are the innovators. But in order to sell the early adopters, we know we need to lower the price. So a very different mindset when we think about how we're determining the price. So that's a good example, a great example of cost-plus pricing. Standard markup is a percentage of the cost. So if it costs us, let's say the markup is 100% of cost. If it costs us $50, we sell it for, what, $100. If it costs us 100, we sell it for 200. In some categories, that's common. In apparel, for example, it's very common to have a minimum of 100% markup. In other markets, for example, in housewares, the markup is 30 to 50%. And in grocery, the markup is actually much lower. In some grocery items, it's 6, 9, 11, 12%. So we need to understand the category. We need to understand the industry in which we operate. And it's important for us as we think about selling our products worldwide, we need to understand what are the margin requirements. Because if we're going to sell if we expect our retail partner in Japan, for example, to sell the product for $10 US, then, and their requirement is 100% markup, then we're going to have to sell it to them at $5. So at $6, they might say, "No, I can't do that," because they have, as a retailer, they have a target profit approach to pricing. So they're maybe focused on the gross margin percent versus dollar sales or the unit sales. So retailers focus a lot on shelf space productivity. So you have a certain limited amount of shelf space. And what we do is we look at a given section. We have a 4-foot section, 8-foot section. Very often the merchandisers are standard are 4-foot sections, but then there's adjacency. So we take one 4-foot section and put it next to another 4-foot section, and then you could have a whole aisle that's 24, 30 feet. Retailers look at sections and aisles to determine how productive they are. So they have a choice to either carry our product or Reuben's product or Noah's product. And they're thinking, well, what about, let's see, if I take Noah's product off the shelf, maybe I could put something else there that I could sell more units of, that'll generate more sales at a higher gross margin. So we need to understand what are the objectives of the retailer. We might try and suggest to the retailer who has a target profit approach to pricing that they should carry our product and accept only 20% margin instead of 50%. So I've been in some meetings where the buyer for the retailer insisted, because this was the goal of the organization, that they get 50 points of margin on the product instead of 20 points. But we would argue, based on what we know about elastic markets, about price-sensitive markets, that if they're making 20 points instead of 50 points, that they would sell a lot more units. And that their total sales would be more. And what about the total dollar amount of profit? But for their organization, they weren't focused on that. They wanted that every transaction would be able to deliver 50 points of margin. That they would get 50-point markup. But we would argue, well, wait a minute, you can't take percents to the bank, you only take dollars. So if you sell a lot more units, and your total sales is greater, and your total gross margin is greater, isn't that the best thing to do? And in that organization, well, that's a plausible argument. In that organization, they said, no, every transaction has got to be 50 points. Questions about that? So we talked today about, what did we talk about? We talked about advertising internationally. We talked about reach, frequency, pulsing, flighting. We talked about expatriates. We talked about pricing strategies in an international setting. Demand-oriented pricing, such as skimming, penetration, prestige pricing. We talked about cost-oriented approaches, including cost plus and standard markup. We talked about target profit as an approach to pricing. And what else? What else did we talk about? Did we miss any? Demand, cost, target profit. So we're good. Are we great?
Awesome.
Yes. All right. Have a good one.
I'm hungry.